Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Next speaker is Charlotte Francis. In her work at Strategic Grants, Charlotte has regularly presented grant seeker workshops in Hobart, Adelaide, Canberra, Melbourne and Sydney, which are consistently well received and highly evaluated. Charlotte also represents organisational grants program review workshops, where she works with senior management staff in not-for-profit teams to create and put in place processes around project development, project matching, funder stewardship and application writing. Charlotte has worked across a variety of not-for-profit sectors in both the UK and Australia in roles including events, corporate sponsorships, appeals, trusts and foundation fundraising. She'll be discussing with us today grant seeking essentials, what you need in your backpack. Please welcome Charlotte Francis.
Hello, and thank you to Collins & Co for inviting me here today. Just a quick word about who Strategic Grants is. We're an Australia-wide organisation. As the name suggests, we are all things grants. We work with a number of clients from really small organisations with a revenue sort of under $1 million, even less, right up to big multi-million-dollar organisations on everything to do with grants. We produce customised grants research calendars that enable organisations to stay across ever-changing deadlines. We help with writing, strategy, training, capacity building, evaluation, the lot. What I want to do today is to just talk about some of the essentials of grant seeking and really some of the pitfalls to avoid. And I'm hoping that you can take away today some tips to implement. Can I just have a show of hands to see who is directly involved or even in any way involved in grant seeking in your organisation? Okay, great. And who's actually directly doing it and it's their sole job? Okay, great. So what we're doing is we're using a bit of a metaphor, the old backpack, and what we need in our backpack to go forward. And just a little story to start with, because backpacks can be used for many things. And in fact, we heard Walter this morning talking about Alana and Madeline Foundation. That's a really lovely use of backpacks for those children who are escaping violence. But at the weekend, I went to Womadelaide, the music festival, and really needed my backpack and survival kit. I had my water, my sunscreen, my keep cup, my comfortable cushion. It's actually quite a workout for the body, sitting and listening to endless music without a chair with a back. I needed all my bits and bobs and wristband, money, the lot. And one really lovely story that came out of that is related to grants is one of the acts I saw was the Central Australian Aboriginal Women's Choir. And I met their director, Maurice Stewart, probably about 10 years ago when I was doing a bit of work for an organisation called RecLink. And he was beginning the process of trying to get some funding for this choir, which he now runs. And it was a wonderful thing to see that they are now performing in Womadelaide. They have performed at the Hamer Hall in Melbourne. They've performed at the Sydney Opera House. They have made a film called The Songkeepers. They have travelled back to Germany to where the roots of their songs, so the Lutheran missionaries that came out to Hermannsburg in the early days, they have taken those songs back, those early hymns translated into indigenous languages. So that was a lovely story and does talk to the power of grants because, of course, they have got funding for that. And I was delighted to hear that their success rate, their hit rate, is now about 90%, which is very, very high when you consider that the sector benchmark is probably more around, if we're talking an average, 25 to 30%. Anyway, enough of that story. We'll get back to our own grant-seeking backpack and let's look at what we need to put in place. So why do we need a strategy? Well, the first thing is really we just need to admit that we need a strategy. If any of you heard Pamela from AskRight this morning, she was also very emphatic about the need for strategy, and I really liked her quote that having no strategy, there's high activity but very low impact, a lot of running around. So we need to understand that for this process, we do need a strategy, and preferably that is an understanding that is shared across your whole organisation, because all elements of the organisation will be feeding into this process. Another thing we want to be clear about is that grant seeking is part of major gift fundraising. So yes, you do need money from the funders, but they need you to be carrying out the programs in the community and helping them meet their philanthropic aims. So it's about achieving positive outcomes for the grant maker, your organisation and the community, and it's about getting away from that mentality that it's the them and us. It really is about a partnership, and we shouldn't be afraid of chatting to them and approaching them. So what are we going to put in this backpack of ours? We're going to put a few things in. So one of the top ones is a key message statement. Now, this is a fundamental document that will save you hours of time, which really covers, amongst other things, your point of difference, your key achievements, as well as the basics of who you are, when you were started, your history, and indeed there are some overlaps. If you heard Bianca Crocker talking on Case for Support, some of these key chunks of information might translate across the two documents. Of course, with the Case for Support, it might be more passionately put, depending on how you're writing. But we do need that key message statement. We need a wish list of projects. What are we seeking funding for? And of those projects, we need plans and budgets and the people who are going to put those together and sign off on them. We need a list of funder deadlines, and of course that means you doing your research, whether it's through a provider like us, or AskRight, or whether it's our community. However you're doing that, we really need to do that research. A recorded grants history. So have you got in one place a collated history of previous funders who funded you before? Because if not, that might be something that you need to work on. A sustainability plan. Of course, we need to future-proof our projects, what will happen when the funding ceases, as well as our organisations. How about a clear and current website? Is that all up to date? Often when I'm preparing for a grant seeker workshop, I sometimes check out all the different organisations that are coming. In fact, I always do. And sometimes I notice that there are things on there, there may be an event that's being advertised and it's still 2018. So keeping that up to date is really important. And of course, having a good writer. And once we've got all these elements, we do need to be thinking process. So who is going to put together the budgets and the project plans? Who's going to be keeping the history up to date, and how? Who signs off on the grant applications when it's submitted? Making sure all this is documented and coordinating really does save so much time and stress, because often the deadlines are quite short for grants and you really don't want to be scrabbling around at the last minute. So if there's one thing, just one thing that you take away from today, it would be to work on, if you haven't already, this key message document, and I'll talk about the headings and what's in that in the next couple of slides. So it needs to be clear, so that's well written. It needs to be compelling and engaging. It needs to be concise. You want it nice and tightly written. We don't want it waffly. It needs to be consistent. Now that means we need to be consistent across the organisation. You don't want to be saying different things on your website, on other areas of social media, in your flyers, in your brochures, in your newsletters. We want that consistency of messaging. Obviously, it needs to be correct, it needs to be certified, signed off on your board, and it needs to be current. So what might we include in a key message document? So obviously, organisational description. Now, this is often question number one. It might seem simple, but what happens is that organisations will ask you, it might be that you've got to describe yourself in just 50 words. Some might say 100 words, some might say 250 words. So actually, nutting out these organisational descriptions in one document of varying lengths before you start already gives you a bit of an edge, because it's going to be much quicker and you can cut and paste and put that in. And of course, the shorter description could also double up as your elevator pitch. being really clear about what you're saying, and being able to say that verbally as well. Vision, mission, and purpose, that's fairly clear and obvious. Your organizational history. How did you come about? What's your history? Your key achievements. Who are you helping? In what area and how many? The number of staff and volunteers and profiles. Often some grant makers like also to see profiles of your board members as well. Funding breakdown, that's obviously key, and that's going to change year on year, so you need to be keeping this document up to date. In fact, we recommend you do that quarterly. You need needs data, so what's the evidence that supports your work, and can you back that up with stats? Your niche offering, so that, as you know, there are many, many charities in the space and some in the same sector, so how are you different? What makes you different? What partners are you working with? Can you give examples of successful projects and case studies? A number of organizations do that via videos on their website, nice little clips from case studies, people who have benefited from their work, which I think works really well. Can you include your top strategic priorities for the next 12 months and even 3 years? And how are you as an organization measuring your efficiency and your effectiveness? And then how are you measuring the effectiveness of your programs and your program performance? Obviously, at the end of this document as well, it's good to have all those sort of legal and other statements, you know, your DGR, your tax concession status, your address, your bank details. But having this all in one place really, really helps, and it can be used across a number of different communications along the organization. So then we're going to think about projects themselves. So first of all, let's make sure that what we're doing is on mission and in line with your strategic plan. Too often, we see organizations that are seeing a funding round announced and are going off on a tangent and trying to fit it to the funder. So you've really got to make sure that you're doing your core business and what's in your operational plan and according to your mission. And we also need, as I've said, it was in the key messages, evidence of the need. So for each project, we need to be able to show the need. So that might be that you've run a previous program and have feedback from participants. It might be sector information, government stats, maybe on homelessness, population statistics, CIFA data. It could be global evidence. It could be that there's a certain model out there that you're referring to. Perhaps it could be an academic paper that a housing first approach to homelessness works, et cetera, But whatever it is, that is really key to your project, because if you can't demonstrate the need, then how can you present the solution? What strategies are you going to use to achieve your aim? So what are you actually going to do, and in what time frame? So really the steps that you're going to implement to achieve your outcomes. So talking about outcomes, we need to be really clear what are the outputs. And I'm just going to digress a bit. So outputs and outcomes, so often I see this, it gets muddled in applications. So the outputs is the product, the service, the actual thing you are delivering. So the outcomes are more the changes for beneficiaries. So to use an example, if it was, let's say, a school breakfast program in rural and regional Australia, the actual output is the delivery of the school breakfasts and to how many children. So there you've got your beneficiary count. The outcomes might be improved concentration through having a full belly. It might be improved behaviour, again, through having had an adequate breakfast. It could be better concentration, and that longer term could translate as improved educational outcomes. But we really need to be clear between the two. And we also need to explain how are we going to measure what we're doing, because funders are looking increasingly at more sophisticated measures of our outcomes. What is our impact? Because they want to see the value of their investment in the community and that what we're doing is actually working. And if we're not measuring something, how can we manage it? So that's a really important part of it. And also, can you deliver the project in the time frame? So being really careful when you're looking at a grant to research, okay, if it's March, the deadline, when do they distribute the funding? Because you must make sure that your program doesn't start before the funding. The retrospective funding is an absolute no-no. To give an example, perpetual trustees, I don't know if hands show, has anyone applied to perpetual trustees here? Yes. So you will know, A, that that's quite a workout, and B, that they distribute so the funding deadline is early December each year, and they then distribute the funding on the 30th of June. So if you're applying to perpetual and you're working on it October, November, December this coming year, you need to know that your project cannot start till the 1st of July 2020. So those are the kinds of things we need to be keeping in mind. So when it comes to measuring the outcomes of our projects, how do we do this? Well, number one is to build into your project design the evaluation, because we need to know right at the outset of the program, what data do we need to collect? What is the baseline data against which we're measuring the program progress? So that's number one. And the kind of data we collect is obviously dependent on the outcomes we want to measure. And it may be that you have some pre-existing data because you've run an event, you've run a project, and so that's your starting line. In our evaluation toolbox, we're looking at quantitative tools, counting measures, that pretty much speaks for itself, and the qualitative tools are more about the human experience, as you would expect, focus groups, surveys, interviews, that kind of thing. To use a really, really simple example, just to be clear about this, let's say that we are putting in for a new printer because we're going to print in-house our marketing collateral and events flyers and other materials rather than outsource them. So a really simple quantitative measure would be a reduction in overheads because we're doing it in-house and we can look at before we purchase the printer and after. As well, another outcome might be the increased ability to communicate with funders and beneficiaries, and that could be measured just before and after, so the number of newsletters and flyers that we've been able to produce before the printer and now that we've got it. We can also do a bit of a quantitative measure. We could phone or do a simple survey to funders and beneficiaries about whether they feel more informed about the work we're doing, and we could trace that back to the printer. We could also look at increased attendance at events due to our new printer, because we could look at the head count before and the head count after. So a lot of it is pre and post testing, but it's having that baseline and being really clear about what we're trying to measure that is important. So budgets, the thorny issue of budgets. So it's very important to include all the costs. So that means all the costs to deliver your program. So that means the staffing, the overheads, any in-kind costs that we can attribute to this. Don't make figures up. Sometimes it's a little bit, sometimes you will have a budget all ending in zeros, but sometimes if that's constantly the case, that can be a bit misleading, and it might suggest that you've done a bit too much rounding up and inventing. So do seek quotes, and don't make the figures up. And also put in where you have co-funding. So funders really like to see that you have other sources of funding. They don't want you to just be relying on them as one source of funding. So put in other sources of funding. And it sounds obvious, but make sure that your income and expenditure align, because sometimes, we get to help many organizations with writing, and you'd be surprised how many budgets I get where I think, hang on a minute, how come the income and expenditure are different? And as we're saying here, do include the in-kind contribution, because of course it has a value. Now this could be volunteer time, if volunteers are helping do the work that you would otherwise have to pay someone to do. And there are various websites and sources that can put a dollar value against skilled volunteering and unskilled volunteering. But also it could be that a partner is donating a venue, or they could be donating the catering. So if you put the value of that in both your income, that's the value of what they're giving, obviously, and then your expenditure, what you would have had to pay otherwise, that should be part of your budget. And make sure that that all tallies and that it's not difficult to read. The last thing we want is a funder looking at a budget and scratching their head and thinking, hang on a minute, something's not right here. So it really does need to be very clear, and where there's the opportunity to present a budget narrative as well, explain it out. So if you've given a salary, it could be, is it a full-time position? Is it that the project's running for 20 weeks and you're paying this person X amount of hours? Break it down as much as you can so that funders can see how you've arrived at your final figures. So, grants histories. So I'm just going to ask a few more questions. So who here is really confident that in their organisation they have got really clear full grants histories, and you know exactly who's funded you in the past and for what, and that all your acquittals are done? Good. That's fantastic to see some hands. Really good. Congratulations. For those of you that aren't so sure, it is actually a really, really important part of the process. Because for number one, of course, current donors, past and current donors are your best prospects. You want to be going back to them. And you need to make sure that all the acquittals have been done. Now, if it's a big multi-year project, you need to be making particularly sure that those are all done. But even if it's just an annual report, you want to make sure that those are done and acquitted and it's clear across the organisation. What about the relationship status with your, hang on, where have I got to? Yeah, with your current and previous grant makers. Who's handling that? How are you coordinating that? Who makes the prospect calls and manages those relationships? And we'll talk a bit about the prospect calls in a moment. But I really can't stress enough how important it is to capture these histories and have it all organised. I've been working with a client who supplied me with a history, and there's so many gaps. And of course that's difficult because you don't know whether they've applied to them before. Is there a relationship there? Did it work? Did it not? So that's just could be another action for you. So grants are only part of the mix. We talked earlier in our backpack, we've got this diversified funding strategy. We want to reduce our risk. Obviously, if we are over-relying on one particular source of funding, if and when that source dries up, then we are a little stuck. So we really need to have a diversified strategy so that we're not exposed to risk, and neither are the funders who are funding us. And part of the reason for that as well is that funding is a long game. As we've discussed with the perpetual, often you don't know the result for a good 6 months, and with some funders longer. So it's also not just about your organisation, but it's about future-proofing your organisation, but also the project. So funders want to know that you're going to be able to carry on doing the work you're doing, and that you have strategies for both project continuation and your organisation. And that can be a difficult question. When you get to the end of the grant and it says, when the funding, after the granting period, how will you continue this project? Well, sometimes it's because one answer could be that you are working up a model to prove to government that should then be funded by government. It could be that you are capacity building, and that the participants in a project, that you are enabling them to carry on those skills, and that the project sort of is self-perpetuating. Or it could be simply that it's an ongoing project. I did a maternity cover once at Sacred Heart Mission. They get money year in, year out for their dining room, where they fund people who are experiencing homelessness and disadvantage. That's an ongoing funding need, and that's clear, and it's fine to say, we will be looking for ongoing funding. So what is your funder relationship strategy? Really, this is about the who, what, why, and when. So who is doing what, and being really clear. So one of the things is, do you call the funder before you apply? We always recommend that you pick up the phone and apply and chat to them before applying. And indeed, many funders will actually specify this. I'm thinking, one of them is Helen Macpherson Smith Trust, the Ian Potter Foundation. They actually require you to phone first. So one tip, if you're ringing a funder, if it's an existing funder, you may be thanking them for past funding and building on that, and you don't need to introduce your organisation. If it's a new funder and you're ringing for the first time, as well as obviously asking if it's a good time to talk to them, but the key is to say, I've had a good look at your website and I've looked at your funding criteria and guidelines. Because what you don't want is to get into a conversation where they say, well, actually, we're not funding disability. This year our focus is on, disease prevention. So it's really good to do your research before you do that. But also within the organisation, is it one key person that is communicating with funders, or is it several? Because as you know, it may be that your CEO has spoken to the CEO of a funder. If that happens, we just need to capture that information so that the person who's working on the grants knows that the CEO has spoken to whoever it is, the CEO of, let's say, Ian Potter, and that is documented in your CRM, because you don't want that person to then call somebody else and not know what was said in the conversation. So that's really important. And that's all about coordinating your communications with funders and recording it on your CRM. Do you have a strategy for connecting with funders? So even outside of the granting period, invite them to things, keep them in the loop, don't bombard them. Of course they're busy, we are all inundated with information, but if they have funded you or have a link to your organisation, it might be that you let them know that you're moving premises, that you have a new CEO. You might invite them to an event. And if you have a project running, you might just ring them or email them to say that a key milestone's been achieved. So we have a lovely example at Strategic Grants. We had a lady called Judy working for us who used to work at the St. George's Foundation. So she was a grant maker, and she describes how an organisation, I think it was a camp for disabled children, and the person who had got the grant rang Judy in the middle of a children's camp, and children were screaming with delight and playing, and she rang to say to Judy, this is what your money has funded. And Judy said it was the best thing. The children screaming and whooping in the background was, probably more powerful than an acquittal report. So it's finding those links, and, funders want to know, and it's our feedback that enables them to see what is working in the community. And it's also important to communicate with funders when things aren't going to plan, because we may set out on our project, we've got our timelines and our deliverables. As you know, life doesn't always go to plan. Something changes. If something changes to the project, let the funder know. Don't wait till the end of the funding period. Don't, at the end of the 12 months, say, well, actually, we didn't do this, we did this. Let them know, communicate with them, be transparent. It might be that if you can explain why it's different. If it's a major change, it might be that you're going to ask that funder if they'd be happy to fund the sort of slight shift in program. Because what I do know from talking to funders, we have lots of interactions with funders, is they don't want to give the money back. It's a real hassle administratively as well as everything else. So the better you do all this approaching and thanking, the more successful you're going to be. And another thing around the thank you, we were talking to Vedran Drakulic from the Gandel Foundation, and he was saying that actually it is staggering, only about 15% of organisations do the thank you well. So there really is room for improvement, because we know when organisations do the thank you well, which is way over and above just sending the thank you letter and the receipt, they probably will get funded again. And we have all sorts of lovely examples. We had one client in Brisbane who they'd received money for some Indigenous workers to be going out in rural and remote areas manning ear clinics. And they'd done so well that demand was outstripping supply. They rang the funder to say, this is an out-and-out success, and we need another health worker. And the funder said, I'll fund another one. Just because they'd kept that communication going, they've involved the funder and told them a bit about the project, given them an opportunity. The other thing is, what do you do? Going to go back. What do you do when a funder's website says, we don't accept unsolicited applications? It doesn't necessarily mean a closed door. What you need to do is look at your research if you can. So what have they funded in the past? What kind of projects? Is there a link? Do their funding criteria and guidelines and philosophies, does it really align with your organisation? If so, you might look, if there is information available, might do some research on their trustees. Do any of your board members or volunteers or anyone in the organisation have a connection? Could that be a way in? And if not, even then the door isn't entirely closed, because some of these, what I call unsoliciteds, they actually have on their website a contact form, and or they have an info at or a phone number. So the door, in my mind, is slightly ajar in that case. And as I say, if you have a really good alignment and you really think that what you're doing fits their granting philosophy, then by all means contact them and say, I see that you don't fund, you don't take unsolicited approaches, but I feel there's a really strong connection between what you're wanting to achieve and what we do. Would you be open to a chat, a meeting? And just give it a go. Oops, watch is falling off. So you might think, why do we need such a full backpack? We're groaning under the weight. Well, the number one thing is that it is highly, highly competitive. So there are, I think it's one charity for every 444 people in Australia. Now, not all of them have DGR status. I think there's about, now I've just noted it down here and I've lost it now, but there's about 16,500 charities with DGR1 status who are our main competition. But there are more applications out there than philanthropic dollars, which is why we really want to focus on a best practice approach to get ahead of the game. So how can we do this? So really nice quote there from Leonard Very. And what we want to do is to present really well. So one of the things is timing. Again and again, I have clients coming to me really last minute. So last week, I had a client who said, Dear Charlotte, can you help with this one? And it was a FRRR, the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal. It was a grant due on the 14th. And this was, I think it was the 6th or the 7th. And I thought, wow, that's quite last minute. We've got a public holiday coming up at the weekend. And so I had a look at their website, the funder's website, and they said it is essential that you chat to us before submitting a grant. So I went back to my client and I said, Blogs, have you actually chatted to the funder? Oh, no. And I said, well, I really don't recommend you put this in. If you haven't written it yet, you haven't got a really well-developed project plan, and you haven't spoken to them, if you ring them now, it's going to present badly. It's going to look as if you're really disorganized. So we always recommend forward planning. Get this all organized. Have your project plans, as we've discussed, all developed with the budgets worked out and signed off. And aim to submit really at least a week in advance, never on the closing date. Now, the other things is to I keep saying this, but really make sure that the projects you're delivering do align with your business plan, your operational plan, that you're not doing it to fit the funder. You're not seeing an opportunity and thinking, ooh, we could do X, Y, or Z. You need to have that identified need. You're the experts in the community, and again, that's how funders learn what the need is. So you really need to be staying on track. And again, we need to be really organised with the way we develop our projects, because if we're not organised at the project development stage, then it's going to come back and hit us in the face when we try and do the report. So again, sketching out that project plan, building in the evaluation, collecting that baseline data so that when you come to write the report, you can look at the baseline compared to where you are and write a good report against the outcomes that you have stated in your funding application. So, yep, it's a bit to do, but it really does save time and stress. And another point to remember is that all of this work, some of it will be able to be used across other donor communications across the organisation, donor reports and letters, so none of the work is wasted. So now we've got our backpack full, we're going to go forth. We really need to be finding that alignment, that intersection between the funder's objectives and our project outcomes. So we're going to have a grants research strategy. So how do we find out with our research? So we really can find a lot from if they have a good website. Obviously, some of the PAFs don't, and they take a bit more digging, and that came up in one of the earlier sessions, and you might need to buy a PAF guide, and there are various providers. All of our customized grants calendars include relevant PAFs to you. That's just something to think about. But you can look at their website, so you can look at their annual review. You can look at what they've funded in the past. Now, Ian Potter, absolutely amazing. Their funding database goes back to about 1960-something, with everything they've funded. Obviously, you can be looking a bit more recently, but it's really interesting to look at not just what they're funding, but what kinds of projects. Are they really hot on capacity building? Is it more that they like to seed fund? Do they like pilot projects? Do they fund or don't they capital, or is that an exclusion? So dig around and try and get under their skin. Look at their motivation. You can tell a lot from doing that sort of deep dive. And think to yourself, is this really the right funder for us to collaborate in a partnership with on our program? The other things to bear in mind are, look at the grant range. So, if their top grant is $5,000 and you've got this huge, great project, well then that's probably not a good investment of time. Again, going back to looking at their time frame, we've talked about that. Where do they fund geographically? Make sure it's in your area and not just one state that it doesn't align with where you are. So do your research, find that, and then do your project matching, and then phone them. As we discussed earlier, pick up the phone and, just say to them, have they got a few moments? Make sure you tell them you've read their website, and then really lead with the outcomes of your project and what you want to achieve and how much money you're seeking funding for. So at the end of all this, how do we actually measure what we're doing? We've talked about measuring performance as an organisation, how efficient and how effective we are. Those are questions that are asked by Perpetual. But how do we measure the success of our grants program? And so often I get clients, I had one who said to me, "Oh, Charlotte, since we've been working with you, we've written about, 30 grants." And I said, well, that's great. That tells us we've been busy, but that's all it tells us, because it doesn't give us any measure of success. So playing the numbers game, if any of you are under pressure from boards or managers, it's not about the numbers. So what we want to be looking at are things such as, have we identified new grant sources? Are we diversifying our funder base? What about number of conversations with funders? That's a tick. When we've picked up the phone, had those conversations, or maybe we've met them out networking. We always encourage going to briefings. When funders offer briefings, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation's one, many government funders, funding streams will offer a briefing evening. Go to them. It's your opportunity to get in front of the funder. Positive feedback. I had a client recently who got positive feedback on an application. It didn't make the grade, but it got positive feedback, and they said, have a go in our next round. So that's a big thumbs up. What about increased interest from funders? Obviously, improved success rate. That's a no-brainer. Have you reached your budget targets? Are you getting repeat gifts? That's a sure sign you're doing something right. Have you got a satisfactory cost-profit ratio? Have you delivered 100% of your funder reports on time? Again, that's a tick. That means you're following due process and doing it correctly and with a best practice approach. And you know you're successful when funders approach you. And actually, I had that when I worked at Sacred Heart Mission. There was a smallish funder in Victoria that had funded them year in, year out. And I had sent the application. Now, I don't know if it got lost in the post, or was I having a tired moment, got the wrong postcode? I don't know. But all I know is that the closing date came and went. I thought my application was safely there. I had a call from the trust administrator to say, we haven't received your annual application. So it got lost somewhere. And I thought, well, that's a really wonderful thing when the funder comes to you because they've noticed your application's missing. So that's a sure sign of success. So let's just recap on what these essentials are. Get your processes and documents in place before you start seeking grant funding. Try and avoid that reactive, scrambling for a deadline, creating a project on the fly that's not backed up with data. Make sure that you understand your funders' reasons for funding, getting into their heads and motivation. Do forward plan, and ensure the grants you are spending your time on really match. I mean, I've said that many times, and that's because we see it so often, people going off at a tangent. And persevere. I would add to that, be clear about the lines of responsibility in your organisation, who's doing what. And also with the writing, have a good writer, but also whoever's doing the writing, get another pair of eyes to proofread it, because we all make mistakes. Conversation and conservation can come out wrong and we can't see it because we're too close to it. If you can't get someone to proofread, I print it out and I literally read it out line by line because mistakes do happen. The other thing is to be really vigilant about checking the template, because many funders have a set template, and as you know, they have stringent word counts and character counts, and you do need to stick to those. If they say 500 words or 500 characters, they don't mean 501. So do stick to those, and also be clear about the attachments you're sending. If they invite attachments, they may be very specific and ask for your financials and an annual report. They may not, but certainly don't add attachments unless invited. Don't sort of bombard them with material. And the other thing on the questions, before I invite questions from you, is do answer the question on the form. You'd be surprised, it might say, what is the need for the project? And somehow somebody's just maybe in a rush or so passionate about the project, they actually start to describe the project. And actually what they want is the need. How many homeless people are there? What is the problem? What's happening with the environment? So answer the right question in the right place. And talking about questions, I'd now like to open it up to the floor and invite questions on all things grants. Anybody got anything at all? Yes.
Writing grants or programs that we deliver. Who funds the grant writer? That's obviously a challenge a lot of organisations have. Is it wrong in your grants to put a factor into that?
So you can certainly, in a line in your project, put project overheads. Because somebody's got to run that program, you need to manage the program, your evaluation should be in there, and overheads. So you can include that as part of your overheads and admin cost, yes. You don't need to specify it's the grant writer. Really, you're looking for that contribution that is for the whole delivery of that project. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. It's kind of
very focused on funding programs, so to a large extent, they're sort of capital projects,
It is, and in fact, I wish I could just zip up a slide here, but I could follow up for you. We've actually, I forget which research body, but I can definitely send it to you. It's a really interesting slide about which funders, most of them, as you say, fund program costs. They love innovation, but there are some funders which fund capacity building, some organisational costs, capitals, and obviously evaluation is something you can get funding. So it really does come down to doing your research and finding those funders. I mean, for example, RE Ross Trust here in Victoria, they have their various areas of their focus areas, but they fund capacity building. Perpetual funds capacity building. And other ones will fund capital. It really is, the devil's in the detail. It's about doing fine combing through those guidelines. But you're right, that a greater percentage will fund those other sexier areas, sadly. Anything else? Going, gone? Thank you very much.